Scriabin, Musical Philosophy. I am David Proud, PhD researcher at the University of Liverpool. Peoples, blossom forth, create, negate me, rise up against me. I resurrect all you terrors of the past, all monsters and frightful, horrible visions. I give you full flower. Try, swallow me up, lay open your dragon's pasture. Serpents try and round me, strangle me, bite. Everyone and everything seeks my destruction, and when you fall upon me, that is when I begin my play. I will conquer you by loving you. I will surrender and seduce you. That is Scriabin, referring to his seventh piano sonata. He was immersed in the dialectical philosophy of a German idealist philosopher, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, for whom the concept of determinate negation, that is, negation with content, was central in explaining the evolution of concepts, and it had far-reaching metaphysical consequences. So we find recurrent references to Hegelian dialectical negation in his writings. For instance, in this poem, which was written in connection with the poem of ecstasy, strike against me, negate your love, your moments each by each I create by negation of earlier experience. I am forever negation. So what is Hegelian negation? What does Hegel mean by negativity? Well, it's important to understand that for Hegel, no thing or content is simply false. And this is from the phenomenology of spirit. True or false belong amongst those determinate notions which are held to be inert and wholly separate essences, one here, one there, each standing fixed and isolated from the other, with which it has nothing in common. Against this view, it must be maintained that truth is not a minted coin that can be given and pocketed ready-made, nor is there such a thing as the false, any more than there is something evil. The evil and the false, to be sure, are not as bad as the devil, for in the devil they are even made into a particular subjective agent, as the false and the evil. They are merely universals, so though each has its own essence as against the other. So to be false is to partake in a particular sort of relation, whereby were the relation to change, the falseness might also disappear. And to be true is to partake in another sort of relation, so truth and falsehood are analogous to consonance and dissonance amongst musical notes. The note C is not merely euphonous or true, in the context of our analogy, or cacophonous or false. It acquires these qualities in different situations and different relations. A musical key provides a context within which every note appears with a different value, and for the most part, being in accord with the key is being in accord with the whole. To be in tension with the key is to be in tension with the whole. Such a dynamic relation of tones provides us with a helpful way to think about the dynamic relation of thoughts. Truth occurs when a thought is in a robust relation to the whole, and so falsehood designates a thought that is grating against the whole. We overlook this due to a failure to articulate for ourselves the whole, that is the actual source of our judgment of truth and falsity. Frequently it's the case that the context for judging truth and falsehood is simply a matter of convention, with the consequence that it is so widespread as to be regarded as universal and necessary, when it is in actual fact arbitrary and contingent. Insofar as this context remains unexplored, assertions regarding what is true and what is false appear to have a general applicability as opposed to applying to a specific historical or cultural context. So often we make a presumption, albeit without making it explicit, with regard to the context of judgment, and fail to recognize the rationale for accepting one claim and excluding another. And in the absence of this specific context, it is true or false in every context. And yet, while some contexts of thought content are simply conventional, other contexts are necessary. It would be falling well short were we to contend that truth is merely subjective, as it is to contend that it is merely objective. We partake in many contexts simultaneously, resulting in confusion when we assume that what maintains in one area maintains in another. The bane of philosophy is sophistry, and the sophist will frequently employ uncertainty in one area to promote a general malaise and dubiety concerning the very possibility of truth. The sophist aspires to merge together the difference between truth as relational and truth as simply relative. The musical analogy serves us well in understanding what is at stake here. A melody is in need of some dissonance in order to produce more pleasing consonances, and so too thinking is in need of the movement toward falsity, toward the parts, as part of the movement toward truth, toward wholeness. Thinking is a movement in need of attention between part and whole, between analytical understanding and comprehensive reason. We ought to take on a dynamic conception of the true-false relation that will be grounded in the enduring nature of thinking itself. For there is a pattern or a rhythm to the way the thinking moves, which can deliver us for us a kind of rest, a period of calm, amidst relentless activity. And we are not thereby at the mercy of an endless change, thwarting all reason. Think of meditation techniques that focus on the tranquil shape of the moving breath to deliver stability to an errant mind. So too, a system of science, Wissenschaft, we're talking about here, that's in the German, which any systematic inquiry, focuses upon the regular intervals of negativity to bring repose and order to the restless activity of existence and thought. The true, as Hegel says, is the Bacchanalian revelry. Appearance is the arising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away, but is in itself, it subsists intrinsically, and constitutes the actuality and the movement of the life of truth. The true is the Bacchanalian revel in which no member is not drunk. Yet because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose. Drunkenness here symbolizes the viewpoint of self-absorption, and the double negative that no member, Gleed, is not drunk, stresses that every part is in a state of isolation from the others, but the parts are false if taken on their own. To observe through the eyes of one participant in the Bacchanalia is to see something distorted, drunken, false. It's disorder and confusion. But if you observe the whole ritual, we are alive to order emerging out of chaos. While in the grand Bacchanalia of truth, individuals are without proper perspective, nonetheless such drunkenness of the self leads each part to cast off its isolated individuality, as one by one the members collapse, just as the drunken collapse from continual drinking. Each member at last dissolves its own individuality, laying bare a transparent and simple calm, as the frenzied individuality of the drunken dance collapses into a deep collective sleep. And feverish self-assertion leading to self-dissolution that leads to absorption in a greater self. And this, to answer Pontius Pilate, who asked what is truth, this is truth, not the exclusion of difference by desperately holding on to one-sided sobriety and refusing to engage with the false, the partial or the particular, but indulging drunken differentiation to the point of collapse. So truth presents itself by way of participation. No single thought is true or false. Giving expression to truth is one type of movement, giving expression to falsehood is another type of movement, and thinking is in need of both. Thinking is in need of the interplay of self-assertion and self-negation, as in music there is point and counterpoint. Negativity is the term that Hegel employs to give expression to this, though negativity in the Hegelian sense always includes positivity, determination, assertion, which is important for understanding Scriabin's take on this concept. Hegel rejects abstract negation, preferring determinate negation, since the latter is not merely unspecified negation, but assertion through negation. Back to the phenomenology. Since the presentation of a general idea and outline before any attempt to follow it out in detail makes the latter attempt easier to grasp, it may be useful at this point to give us a rough idea of it, at the same time taking the opportunity to get rid of certain habits of thought which impede philosophical cognition. So what Hegel is here saying is he is going to give us a general outline to bring our attention to habits of thinking that form an impediment to philosophical knowing. So this movement of pure essences is what constitutes the nature of a scientific method in general. Regarded as the connectedness of their content, it is the necessary expansion of that content into an organic whole. So the preparatory path ceases to be casual philosophizing that fastens onto this or that object, relationship, or thought that happens to pop up into our mind, whatever, or tries to base the truth on pros and cons. The pathway through the movement of the notion will encompass the entire sphere of secular consciousness in its necessary development. Furthermore, this is one of the ways of thinking that Hegel gives name to, that impedes philosophical thought. Argumentation, in the sense of argumentative, explicitly contrasted with proper method and science, whereby it picks out objects of thought at random as it moves back and forth. It tries to ground truth on the inferences and consequences of rigidly defined thoughts. Argumentation is too rigid in its categories, too slack in its movement. And if the subject matter itself is inflexible, the individual mind has to be the source of movement. Argumentation is ensnared by its fixed thoughts, yet it feels free, given that it can move anywhere between them at will. Argumentation composes its music without a key, and is able to opt to any note it wants at any time. And yet we have from such a procedure is not music. Argumentation mistakenly takes license to be freedom, as it designates subjective thinking, a thinking unable to get beyond itself. Argumentation, as Hegel says, is freedom from all content and a sense of vanity. Eitelkeit is the word in German. Toward it. Argumentative thinking is confident in its own truth as a subjective I, that its willful sense of self overrides all content that it thinks. Argumentation is directed by the conscious aim of a human subject, and hence is inclined to debate, to argumentative attacks on whatever gets in the way of private subjective objectives. Argumentative thinking helps itself to skeptical or sophistical motifs or vacuous formalisms, since the means of thinking are of no concern to it, as it fails to recognize that the means and ends of thinking are the same. We think with a concept to reach the concept. By contrast, now this is a good way of thinking, begreifendes Denken, which translated literally is concept grasping. This is thinking that loses itself in the selfing, so to speak, of what it thinks. It is more difficult to recognize, obviously, for otherwise there would be no need for a system of science. Concept grasping is experienced by ordinary consciousness as a Gegenstoß, a push, a shove backward, a counterthrust. Now, the musicians amongst you might recognize that score as being taken from the poem of Ecstasy, which is full of pushing and shoving and counter-thrusting. Back to the phenomenology. In its negative behavior, ratioinative thinking is itself the self into which the content returns. In its positive cognition, the self is the subject in which the content is related as accident and predicate. Because therein is what Hegel is arguing against, the use of the subject predicate form of the standard proposition impedes speculative thinking. The subject that fills its content ceases to go beyond it in the subject predicate form. It cannot have any further predicates or accidental properties. Picture thinking, or Vorstellung in German, representation, whose nature is to run through the accidents and predicates, and which, because they are nothing more than predicates and accidents that just means properties, rightly goes beyond them, is checked in its progress, since that which has the form of a predicate in a proposition is the substance itself. It suffers, as we might put it, a counterthrust. Instead of being given a positive definition here, Hegel introduces us to this better mode of thinking by negation. For if you could pinpoint concept grasping, it would become a fixed category of argumentation. It is argumentation that pins things down, like a sophistical arguer, pins down an opponent's position in order to raise objections, whereas appreciating the dynamic movement of wholes is what concept grasping does. Albeit this initially appears as a destroyer of all our fixed thoughts, it appears to be determined on introducing chaos and confusion to our familiar categorical groupings. And this is not skepticism, for as opposed to the skeptic, the speculative thinker discovers a new sort of intelligibility in the negations. Philosophers express themselves in consciously difficult language. This is a constant complaint against them. That perplexes us not into a state of ataraxia or tranquility, but into further inquiry. Such deliberately perplexing turns of phrases assist us in our inquiries beyond the borders of propositional truth. Hegel designates speculative sentences. An example he gives is God is being. Being is not a predicate, but an essence. So God ceases to be a fixed subject. God is being. Is calling the question of God is a being into question. Whereas a proposition like God is eternal would assume that God is an eternal being, but we do not assume that God is eternity itself, for that would be a speculative proposition. So it is ordinary predication that is responsible for the theologically accepted and yet philosophically disputed notion that God is a person, a being that loves, becomes angry, and so on. But with a speculative sentence, the question, what is God, is now what is being. Starting off with something we take for vaguely understood, God, the speculative move takes us to something we do not understand in the least, being. Through an annihilation of the vaguely understood fixed subject, the speculative move liberates us to immerse ourselves in the content without prejudice, without artificial restrictions, on that which can be known. What impedes us in our search for truth is the inherited prejudice that God is a being, and as long as we take God to be a being, we anticipate ways of thinking about beings to apply to God. So we anticipate God to be a subject that is the bearer of predicates. So this procedure, which failing to bear fruit, we thereby prematurely conclude either God is an incoherent thought of a being that does not follow the rules of being, or that God passes beyond all human knowledge. Both turn out to make use of presumed knowledge that God is a being, which leads to the rejection of knowledge as such. So, this takes us to a premature rejection of God, religion, Geist, or spirit, the infinite, the absolute, philosophy, whereby atheism is not simply the rejection of God, but the rejection of the human spirit in relation to wholeness, a rejection of reason itself. In theism that asserts God is unknowable, grounded upon a premature apprehension of what knowing is, takes us to the same place. Our inherited prejudicial supposed knowledge that God is a being turns out to be knowledge that annihilates the possibility of knowing. So the perplexity of the speculative proposition liberates us to think once more, albeit we do not feel free, but rather hamstrung. Reading philosophy, we confront unfamiliar obstructions. This is Hegel, as Hegel puts it. We feel free to think whatever we please upon the firm objective ground of some fixed categories, and the loss of this ground feels not like a liberation from prejudices, but like an inhibition by unfamiliar obstructions. Unfamiliar obstructions to thinking's customary free-roaming pursuit of its own agenda are the source of complaints about the incomprehensibility of philosophical writings. We lose our firm objective ground, we experience the free fall of thinking, the weightlessness of thinking, the true freedom of thinking. Thinking has not been inhibited or lost, but what has been lost is artificial, clarity, prejudicial, fixity. So little to lose, and yet we react negatively, and not in the good Hegelian sense, to confusion, perplexity, aporia, speculation, philosophy itself. What we do lose in the speculative proposition is the ego, a subjective agenda which we smuggle into thinking, We lose argumentation and are immersed in concept grasping, thinking for the sake of thinking. And this experience Hegel associates with the floating center of music. Rhythm results from the floating center and the unification of the two. So too, in the philosophical proposition, the identification of subject and predicate is not meant to destroy the difference between them, which the form of the proposition expresses, their unity, rather is meant to emerge as a harmony. The form of the proposition is the appearance of the determinate sense, the accent that distinguishes its fulfillment, but that the predicate expresses the substance, and that the subject itself falls into the universal, that is the unity in which the accent dies away. So we cannot express speculative thought in standard subject-predicate propositions. This is not up to the task of communicating the fluidity and wholeness of thinking. The rhythm born from tension between fixity of propositions and the flow of thinking is what makes the proposition a functional instrument for the expression of the concept. The way into reading philosophy is to acknowledge that which emerges from the tension between sentences and selfhood. We can then understand Hegelian sublation, Aufhebung, overcoming and preserving, the mutual cancellation that maintains the floating center. In music, the tonal center for a musical key provides the value to each note, and the movements between the notes only becomes meaningful movements if some key is established, if some tonal center is discovered. But if the tonal center is too obvious, the musical piece is too predictable, it loses its dynamic quality, it loses its life. There has to be a center, not a fixed center, a rhythmic center with sufficient flexibility to accommodate the dynamic flow of thinking. So now that we are furnished with the understanding of what Hegel means by negativity, together with the notion of a floating center, this will throw some light on Scriabin's music and on his intense reflective outpourings regarding his own sense of selfhood and why together they engender sublime feelings of liberation. Speculative thinking turns towards the whole developing movement rather than isolated accented moments, and the accent of each moment is not disregarded. Each one is significant, but these accents are significant collectively, not as independent from the others. The notes, so to speak, of philosophical thinking are not simply individual words, but entire propositions. For it takes a proposition to express the relation, but the relations thereby expressed are not simply additive, but can be subtractive, contrastive, contrapuntal, harmonizing. False propositions ready us for the recognition beyond the true propositions. The image of a floating center captures the way in which the individual propositions in a philosophical exposition set the boundaries for extremes, and the work of thinking operates between them. Scriabin was a speculative dialectician par excellence, as is evident in there being no simple-minded reduction to the elementary triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which is often associated with Hegel, but is not in fact Hegel. The floating center precludes any such vacuous formalism and such fixed states. Scriabin's music is a Hegelian holistic evolutionary drama. The antitheses, to begin with, were dialectically fused in absolute unity, but this is Cruden-Pallaudi model was later refined and superseded in an alternative diagram, which I will show in a minute, in which negativity is classified as a centrifugal force, pushing away from the center, a progressive element that drives towards a synthetic stage, and that is ecstasy. Scriabin described the negating motion thus: I myself am that which is opposite to me, because I am only that which I engender. The world is an impulse towards God, I am an impulse towards myself. Now here's Scriabin's diagram of absolute unity, which you can look up in Kenneth Smith's book if you want to go into the details. But the important thing to note there is the center, the floating center, from the center. So ecstasy is the highest synthesis, the highest development. Ecstasy is the summit, the last moment, which comprehends the whole history of humanity. This is from Scriabin's notebooks. Through ecstasy, Scriabin sought absolute being. The moment of ecstasy stops being a moment of time, it engulfs all time, this moment of absolute being. So Hegel has established a discourse of processes. Life and death were links in a great chain of becoming. In the process of becoming, there are two sides, birth and dying out, two sides separated in time. But as in nature, so too in history, the process of becoming is at each given period a twofold process. The old idea fades away, and from its debris and devastation at the same time, the new is being born. Scriabin consents to this doctrine. Direct experience does not present a dead content, but a conjunction or series of processes. It is not composed of objects, but of processes. So, to take some examples, Vers la Flamme demonstrates how musical drives can seamlessly evolve. La Poème de l'Extase demonstrates how dialectical leaps can equally structure their advancement towards a focus of desire. In his music, not only are evolutionary schemes dialectical, but they are structured by a primal force or drive expressed through the floating center. I am nothing. I have a will to live. Through the force of my desire, I create myself and my feeling for life. Every state of consciousness is a relationship to another state of consciousness. This means that its appearance is the negation of all else. In this negation, I relate to the other. That is, unconsciously, I struggle with the unconscious form of the other abiding in me. Hence, Scriabin recurrently refers to Hegelian negation. Break rudely into this enchanted world. With light of divine will, it dispels frightening phantoms. Strike against me, negate your love. Your moments, each by each, I create by negation of earlier experience. I am forever negation.